I don't know what we can do about it. Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? Should we start? Yeah? Okay. So as you can see, we have such a diverse panel that we even have a missing person on it. Invisible person for the moment. Yeah, so that's a first, right? So I have a wonderful panel who have so many things to say, and they all come from very different places. So I am going to be very moderate in my moderation. I'm going to allow them to be as immoderate as they really want to be, because each of them has deep experience in wherever they come from, and they interpret diversity within their own context in very interesting ways. So Atiya on my right is one of India's leading textbook publishers, and she has grandmother's experience literally in creating textbooks for children, which have shaped ideas and minds for what, 35 years, 30 years? 35 years. That's like, if I was born 35 years ago, my mind was 90% of what you taught me at some point, literally. Yeah, as soon as I was born. So anyway, so Atiya has some slides which she wants to show, which actually are fairly representative of the kind of diversities that she finds missing in her work. Or over the years, the numbers of times that she's laughed at textbooks for being how stereotypical that they can be, particularly with regard to gender.
Yeah, I laughed in the first couple of years, but then cried more.
So we'll start with Atiya, and then we'll go on to Niko, and then Urvashi, and hopefully the missing person will be with us by then.
You can see that. So I started about 30 years ago, and the first textbook I was supposed to do was a social science book for grades 1 onwards, and our syllabus has in grade 2 it's about in grade 1 it's about my family. A few lines and some illustrations, and the lesson that was I saw a competitor's book, and it starts with my father is the head of the family, and that was the starting point of my realization that this is how things are. He earns for us, he buys things for us. My mother cooks for us, looks after us when we are ill. And then when I started digging deeper and deeper into books, then I realized that the kind of gender stereotyping there is, for no fault of anybody. The person who wrote the book, the person who printed the book, the principal who chose those books, the parents who are teaching it. The mother is teaching this lesson, my father is the head of the family. But because the stereotype is so ingrained in us for generations, that we have, we don't realize what's wrong here. So if there's a story where an uncle visits a household and there's a boy and a girl, and the uncle gets a car for the boy and a doll for the girl, as simple as that, the story. So the girl says, no, I like to play with cars. So then I did some Googling. I don't think it's clear from there. So when a child is born, we like to send cards. It's like a tradition everywhere. Here, when I Googled the card for a baby boy, I found all these. Everything was blue. The next one is for a girl. This is a Google page, a screenshot of a Google page. It's not made by me. It's all pink. Then you go to the next stage, the child is born. Then you go to clothes. I don't have to speak, these slides speak. Again, these are screenshots. Clothes for girls, clothes for boys. This is what we are, and this is just about a year back. So in 30 years, I don't know if I've been able to achieve much. But I've been trying to counter these stereotypes. The next one, please. Toys. The colors, the dolls, the kitchen sets, the other stuff, sewing kits, the craft stuff, and then there are toys for boys. These are all Google pages. So you'll find the superheroes, the cars, the planes, and stuff like that. Just 2 years back on Google, this is what I found. Aage? Yeah. All of us don't understand Hindi, but there is a very, very iconic Hindi poetess, Subhadra Kumari Chauhan. I'm a great fan of some of her poems. But in one poem, she talks about the Rani of Jhansi, one of in 1857, the India's first freedom movement, and she says, "Khoob ladi mardani, wo to Jhansi wali Rani thi." She was so brave that she fought like a man. And this poem was there in every textbook of Hindi of every publisher. And I'm sure they didn't do it. It just didn't strike them. Okay, this is something which, I mean, you are comparing this girl, this queen, this brave warrior queen. She was so brave that she was fought like a man. And as recently as 3-4 years back, there was a movie called Mardani with this Rani. So I don't know the next. Yeah, my father. This. All of you must have studied these nursery rhymes. What are little boys made of? Frogs and snails and puppy dogs' tails. That's what little boys are made of. And then what are little girls made of? Sugar and spice and all things nice. That's what little girls are made of. So just imagine a child of 3 or 4, 5, 6, 7, 12. I mean, those are the formative years. And what does a child read, especially in our country? Right from the age 3, 4 to 18. So what their textbook is the gospel truth for them. What they're reading in the textbooks, that gets into the head. So these nursery rhymes, I think, must be more than 100 years old, Victorian era, but they're still taught in our textbooks.
But actually, I just want to ask you, in the context of the slides that you've chosen, so if you say that you pulled up these Google pages they're about a year old, they would probably be influenced by what the market thinks is something which is no, but then I would really request you to locate your textbooks more firmly in the space of diversity, because I don't know whether we are still reading these rhymes, or are these the rhymes that the popular publishers are publishing?
Yeah, publishers are still publishing these rhymes. Maybe something like who's that? Could not keep her, had a wife and could not keep her. Whoever it was.
Peter.
Peter, Pumpkin Eater.
Yeah.
So those kind of rhymes are not there, but most of them are still there. These kind of rhymes are still there in textbooks. So what we have tried is, we have tried to get our own rhymes done, got something from Ruskin Bond to write. There is a stockbroker, a girl, Royanne Henry. She's just amazing. She's in Bombay. She writes these beautiful poems, girl-based themes. Deepa Agarwal writes wonderful stories. And it's not just the parents or the market which we are fighting against. Our own sales team, which out of 300 people, I think about 280 are boys, men, because those heavy bundles of books the women can't carry from school to school, also the specimens. So we had one story in one of our books. I did it deliberately, got it done, that these boys are playing cricket in the park, and this girl, she wants to be a part of the team, and they said, no, you cannot play with her. So she goes running to her mom, and the mom says, let's form a cricket team of girls. They form a team, then they practice, and I make the girls win. These boys, they got so angry. I am not going to sell this book. ये आपने कैसी किताब बनाई है? How can girls win? So first you have to convince them, you have to sell it to them.
But, I mean, actually you should be...
This is about 15, 20 years
Yeah,
back.
but you should be really happy that all the sales boys read your book before selling it, you know. I mean, I'm not sure that I am stereotyping them myself.
No, then that was about 15, 20 years back. Now they'll ask me, which are the stories in this new reader which are girl-centered? I'm like, why are you asking me that? No, we want to show those to the schools. See, we have a story about Sudha Murthy, we have a story about so-and-so, we have a story where a girl climbs a mountain. So now they ask, because you know it's a Ratna Sagar book, the teacher will go to ask me, is there gender diversity, is there class diversity? All kinds of stereotypes in books.
So clearly gender diversity is a selling point now, right? So which I think we can see as progress over time.
Very minuscule of schools.
Yeah, but then within gender diversity, how do you ensure greater diversity in textbooks? Because
I mean, we don't go overboard, but Dr. Jain, my MD, my founder who recently passed away, he said that after 200 years, if there's excavation of this site, they'll say that there was a publisher who was very biased towards women, girls. All your books are so full of all this stuff you're trying to do. So that's how we do it. I mean, a recent book which I did, it was a series of value education, grades 1 to 8. So the first story of each book starts, there's a character, 2 characters. They are twins, Maya and Zoya. That's another bias I'm trying to handle in there. They just call Maya and Zoya. Nobody says who and what they are. So through Maya and Zoya, from grade 1 to grade 8, at least 8 situations of gender biases are taken care of, including the last book has the gardener getting his daughter married off at the age of 14. So this girl goes running to the granny and says, "Granny, do something about it."
Okay. Okay. Oh, I have another panelist who's missing.
I wanted to see the slides.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to come to you now, Niko. Niko sent me a really interesting list of how he looks at diversity in his workplace, which is OUP. And we were having a little chat outside, and he particularly talked about middle-aged men in positions of power and how they are not open to diversity in different ways. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think we've been talking a lot about gender, and I think I'm going to focus in my comments on race and ethnicity. I think that if you look at the history of New York publishing particularly, it is a history that is essentially steeped in wealthy men who are essentially trying to convert their financial capital into cultural capital. And as a result, unsurprisingly, it's an industry that to this day is blindingly white and is socioeconomically extremely homogenous, meaning everyone is either middle class, upper middle class, or wealthy. And I think if you think about how one tries to change that industry, at Oxford we've basically looked at it through the prism of diversity and inclusion, and I think that diversity is fundamentally about demographics, right? It's about the composition of your workforce, it's about the composition of your subject matter, the composition of your authors, and then inclusion is really about the culture of the workplace. And I think demographics are quite easy. If you look at what has happened in liberal arts colleges in the US over the past 5 years, you had a very strong effort to diversify the student body and to diversify the professoriate. And then after that was done up to a point, administrations all over the country basically dusted off their hands and said, great, got that sorted, on to the next thing. And they were unaware of the fact that when you actually change the composition of your community, you actually have to change the way you teach, you have to change the way you support students. If everybody in your college has come from a private school on the liberal arts corridor between Washington and Boston, and then suddenly you have people coming in from Lagos and from the Philippines, you have a very different environment, you have very different needs. And this then reminds me of what I think is one of the most Great, there we go. Yeah, there's this notion in the annals, I think it's one of the most catastrophic sentences in the annals of American liberalism, the notion of, I don't even think of X person as oftentimes black. That's the sentence. And that notion, I think, has resulted in about 50 years of disastrously self-deluding conversations by white people in America about race, right? Because it's preposterous. No one in America, or a statistically insignificant number of white Americans, do not see race. It's a ridiculous notion. But what it has done, it has created a culture of defensiveness, I think, when it comes to talking about these issues, right? There's a book called Blind Spots and then a book called White Fragility that we've been using a lot at Oxford. And what the book basically highlights, both books highlight, is that the average well-meaning, left-wing, progressive intellectual, when conversations about race begin, they begin the conversation. Is it cutting out constantly, or is it just? It's okay. Okay. They basically start the conversation by wanting to demonstrate how enlightened they are, right? So that's the entire approach, and as a result, their minds are shut, right? Because they're just trying to show how they are right thinking, and that's not a necessarily very effective means of learning and changing. So at Oxford, as we have tried to change our culture, there's certain things that you can do, which is obviously you recruit from different schools than the ones that you used to. We've done that, I think, reasonably effectively. You diversify your internship pool, which is obviously a feeder for the future employees. What's more difficult for us as an academic publisher, though, is to diversify both our author base and to a lesser extent the content, because we are a mirror of the academy, So if I said tomorrow, I want us to have a front list for our philosophy program that consists 50% of women, 50% of men, the net effect would be to cut the size of our philosophy list by about 90%, because the professoriate in the US in philosophy is predominantly men. And I think that one of the most interesting things, and this touched on what we were talking about earlier, there is this notion in the US that college students are basically a giant pain in the ass, right? That they come out of college and they drive people like me crazy. That they're snowflakes, they're unable to be challenged, they want to be nurtured, they want to be protected. And I think there is a modicum of truth to that up to a point, in the sense that when you look at a lot of these colleges, the students and the parents have become consumers, right? They basically pay vast sums of money, and the colleges are astonishingly enjoyable places to spend 4 years. And then they are ejected from paradise, and they come work at Oxford, where we pay them a modest salary and make them do, relatively speaking, boring work in comparison to sitting in a classroom and learning and talking about, global systems and history and so forth. So there's this idea that these students come in and then in this Oedipal way try to take down their middle-aged superiors. And has that happened? Of course it's happened. Is that, I think, broadly representative of the experience at Oxford? Absolutely not. I think that what we found is students come in and they challenge, if they think that an institution is not actually living up to the principles that it espouses, they challenge it. And they do it in a way that I think is much more courageous than certainly was the case for me when I just, at the age of 21, put my head down, presumed this is the way it was, I did as I was told, and that was that. So I will say, learned more from people who are half my age in the last 5 years about many issues involving race, gender, identity, than I have from people who are my contemporaries. And that, to be absolutely clear, because I think this is a crucial point, that is not to suggest, as you sometimes hear when teachers say, well, I learn as much from my students as they learn from me. One of our authors, Tom Nichols, who wrote a book called The Death of Expertise, detests that sentiment. And he says, if that's true, you're a terrible teacher and they're getting ripped off, because that should not be a perfect dialectic. It's fine. You should learn from your students, but you are the teacher. That's why that noun is applied to you. So I think by and large, a lot of this is over. A lot of the challenges in terms of diversification have been in the U.S. have been overblown. But at the same time, the conversations are very challenging, right? They're personal. They force you to confront things that maybe you won't, you didn't see. And as a result, I think it is one of the biggest challenges facing, I think, the publishing industry, because it has been so homogenous. And as we know, when you have people making decisions, and that is a homogenous demographic, then the decisions they make tend to reflect that demographic. So
which actually brings me to the phrase that you used in the email, which was competitive enlightenment. I think that's a very interesting phrase, because if as publishers we see ourselves as custodians, if you like, or gatekeepers of progressive opinions, and we believe we are the sort of creators of knowledge in particular domains, and we would like certain desirable things to be validated more than others, there is this whole business of pushing the pendulum in a particular direction and shutting out voices which are dissonant with what we would like to believe. I don't know whether you've been in India long enough, but we've been going through our own turmoil where we are talking about certain parliamentary acts which have happened, and there's a lot of dissent which is happening on the streets. And there was a hashtag which was going around which said, ban ABVP, which is a right-wing student body. And I was quite disturbed by that, because I don't think that we should ban anybody. And if you ban the ABVP, then you're no different from the ABVP that you wish to ban, because they speak a voice that is not comfortable to you anymore. So when we're talking about competitive enlightenment, how does the dynamic work between the middle-aged boss and the fresh out of Oxford snowflake who doesn't wish to be confronted by the real world and is therefore challenging your authority in from some place of academic understanding of how the world works.
Yeah, I mean, I think those kinds of conversations all hinge on trust, right? So if somebody comes to you and says, "I think that this isn't working well," or I question this decision. Actually, a perfect example. We were at an editorial board meeting, and there was a biography that came up about a famous American judge, and then there was a subsequent book. It was the second book by a female historian, and the first book had done quite well. And the second book was essentially a sort of an expansion of one of the chapters of the first book. And as we were talking about it, I was reasonably enthusiastic about the jurisprudential biography, and I was less enthusiastic about the second book by the woman historian, because as many of the publishers in the room will know, there is a long and storied tradition of you have a successful first book by an author, it does very well, it surprises you, you double down, and then the second book is a colossal disappointment. And so sometimes stepping away from a second book that you want to retain the author, you want to build a relationship, but your confidence in the project is not great. And that in fact was my position. We talked it through, and then afterwards I was approached by one of my junior colleagues who basically said, when you look at that discussion through the prism of gender, you were willing to support a book by a male author about a male judge, but not willing to support the book by a successful woman historian. And I had not looked at it through that prism. And my first response was, I wish you had actually raised that issue at the board meeting, because then I'm sure if you thought that, I imagine other people thought that as well. And I hadn't gone into the level of detail even that I did here about that phenomenon of publishing a second book when you might be best served to let somebody else publish a second book, and then the author will come back to you for a more successful third book. And I thought it was an excellent point, and we had a conversation about it, and I raised it at the next editorial board meeting, and that was that. So I think that, and that's hard, right? Because there is this little part of every person at a certain age where you think you know better, and you don't want to be challenged by somebody who's much younger than you. And it's just an unattractive feature, and it's not very educational, right? I think that those editorial board meetings for us are marketplaces of ideas where smart people from different backgrounds, professional, personal, debate about the intellectual and commercial promise of a book, of a copyright. And that can get fierce too. People, feel very strongly about it, and they have different professional motives and incentives, and applying that same kind of prism. And as an academic publisher, we do a lot of peer review. And so I think that notion of peer review, that you test a theory, that you test an argument, and you do it in a respectful way, but you also don't do it in a way that is, kind of, craven or nervous. I think that I was telling you earlier about, there have been 2 episodes this week in American publishing where a manager made a decision when challenged about the dissemination of a short story and a book. That in both cases, I think, absolutely didn't help solve the discussion or solve the issues being discussed, but just compounded the problem by knuckling under to political pressure, but not responding to the concerns in any kind of a substantive way. And that's not what we should be doing, right? I think that's actually anti-intellectual. We should be engaging with criticism, and that doesn't mean just doing what somebody asks you because they're seen as being progressive, as hence competitive enlightenment. But you take their arguments seriously, and you push back on them if you don't think they're sound. And I think that so far at Oxford, that has been a pretty successful means of trying to change the culture.
So I think, what you're talking about is creating an environment where diversity can actually come into its own, because it's possible, the conditions make it possible for it to happen, because otherwise it becomes like an individual character flaw on the part of the middle-aged manager who didn't respond. So Urvashi, you're going to switch gears a little bit. You've actually spoken about quite different things in what you wanted to say, and you talk about diversity within feminist practice. I want you to start off with that.
I want to ask you a question. When you were talking about the middle-aged man, you kept pointing at Niko.
No, he used the phrase, so yes.
Okay. I was just wondering why, because you kept saying middle-aged man. So I thought, what will you say to me? Certainly not man, but No, okay, so I'm going to talk about diversity within feminist practice, but with a little bit of hesitation after sitting in this room today and hearing Sunny make an impassioned rejection of diversity and inclusion in the previous session, where she said, I don't like those words, they mean nothing, they're like tick boxes, etc. So, in a sense, those words are, I'm agreeing with what you say, but I don't know what else to call it. So how do, in our practice as publishers, how do we bring the world in and not just bring in the voices that already have access to the public world? So for us as feminist publishers, when we first started publishing women, one of the first challenges, and it's an ever-shifting horizon, so one of the first challenges that came up soon into our practice was if we publish in English, and if we are publishing from Delhi, and we are based in Delhi, and if the women whose voices we bring to attention are middle class, educated, privileged, etc., etc., how much are we reflecting the reality of the country within which we are located, and is that what we really want our practice to do? So in some senses, we could have gone on to do that and to congratulate ourselves that we were working against the grain, which is the mainstream male occupation, if you like. And we could still have been seen as being diverse in an environment, trying to break the mold of that and bring in women's voices. But then how far can you congratulate yourself on that if all you're doing is picking up the easiest material that's around and remaining within a particular comfort zone, even if it's a somewhat alternative comfort zone? So we had to ask ourselves, how do we move out of this? And that kind of brought home to me as a publisher that diversity, quotation marks, comprises not only the marginalizations of language, but also other forms of marginalization that exist, such as, for example, religion and region and location and gender and many other things. Also, caste, yes.
Class.
And class, all of those things. And many ways of producing knowledge. It's not the only form of, the forms in which we publish are not the only forms in which knowledge on the ground is produced. So how do we, as a feminist publisher, unpack the category woman or women and look at what that category must and can contain and how it can continually be challenged from within and expanded and stretched to take in more and more? And this set us on the path for looking at other kinds of voices. And I want to give you one short example of a story, a book that we published, which actually, for me, changed the way I was thinking of feminist knowledge and has been really educational. It's a book that Manisha, when she worked with us, worked on. And it was a book in Hindi produced by a group of village women as part of a development program. And it was a book on women's bodies. And when, what they did was, a lovely little story about it is that they produced this book on women's bodies, and in order to show how the woman's body changes from birth all the way through to adolescence, old age, etc., they had to draw the body. And they had to draw the male body because they also talked about sex and so on. And they tested 2 copies of the book in the village, or in the villages in which they worked, and everyone laughed at them, saying that you can't show a naked body in a village because that's not realistic. Nobody in a village is ever naked in public. So they had to go back and rethink how to draw and how to get their message across. And they came up with this completely unique solution, which is that they had the figure of the woman fully dressed as she is in a village, with her head covered with a long skirt and with a blouse, and the man with his chest bare but a dhoti on his legs and a turban on his head. And then you had to lift up the skirt and you could see how she was made from inside, and you could lift up the dhoti and you could see how he was made from inside, and then all sorts of other unique things, including showing the little sperm emerging with ribbons tied around them, being female, and X and Y chromosome, all of those kinds of things, as a beautiful, ingenious book that they brought to us. And we were so excited at this idea of publishing this book that we said to them yes straight away. And they said, we want 2 conditions that we want to impose on you if you take this book up. One is that you will never sell a copy of it to a village woman at a profit. You can sell it in the market at a profit, but every village woman must have this book at cost. And the second condition was that we have 75 authors and all their names must appear on the cover. And that was what really shook me, because I realized that, of course, this is a way of producing collective knowledge. And as publishers, we are trained that, authorship is individual, or 2 or max 3. After 3, even the citations forget the authors. So what do? And so we thought about it. We went back. We then eventually ended up with putting all 75 names on the back cover and no author's name on the front cover. That began for me a process of thinking, okay, this is how you have to rethink content, not only in terms of language, but where it's coming from, what it's saying, how it's produced. How can you, as a feminist publisher, reflect that? And over the years, we've tried to make our list various, diverse, inclusive in all of these ways, although we still continue to publish in English. And we try to put in practice also things of taking feminist content from English out into Indian languages, other Indian languages. I just want to add one more thing, that for me as a publisher, diversity, these kinds of principles we're talking about, is not only about content. It's also about the practice of publishing. Feminist practices in the workplace. How do you put them in place? And it is actually really, really interesting to see, because what comes naturally to you as an employer, as a boss, is the practice of hierarchies that we have learned. What comes naturally to me as a feminist is practicing in collective ways. But if you want to turn your office into a collective, it's a disaster. Nothing will ever get done. So how do you bring those principles of sharing, discussing, consensual decision-making, transparency into a process which is by its very nature opaque and hierarchical? And we've tried to do that. And that brings a challenge that Niko was also talking about, which is that of the middle-aged man, in this case, this aging woman, and a very young workforce who are all feminists in their own right and who have very different ideas from my feminism. And there is often a clash of wills, a clash of thought, which is infuriating and invigorating and eventually a wonderful learning experience, which challenges you all the time. So for me, all of those things, these things sort of meld into each other.
So, when you're talking about feminist practice at the workplace, apart from the invigorating dialogues that happen on the table, and I often overhear them from my little corner, I work out of a corner of Urvashi's office. How does it work after that? I mean, you still get to make the final decision, or not?
Yeah.
Or what?
Eventually, I still get to make the final decision, or the management gets to make the final decision. It's a small workplace, so that can happen. But every decision is thoroughly discussed, put before the office. Everyone's view is taken. And finally, when the decision is taken, how to go forward, that decision is explained to everyone. They may not like it, but at least they have a sense that they have been involved. They have a sense of ownership. Because that idea, that philosophy, that ideology belongs to them. It's theirs. And if I wasn't listening as an employer to their voices, the publishing I do would be completely out of sync with reality. So you have to also see how feminism itself is changing and how you have to reflect that.
Sure. So basically diversity is about expanding your own consciousness in a sense, and being able to include things in it which you didn't think were possible when you first started out.
And thinking differently and being open to that. One example, in the early days what we did was, we saw that everybody in the office was a working woman. I mean, they worked with us, but they also had home responsibilities. And we thought, how can we save them some of these? And we had a vegetable seller who would come into the office in the morning and take down everybody's shopping list for vegetables and would bring the vegetables in bags and put them in their cars or by their tables. It would save them 1 hour. But another office would think, this is nutty. What are these women doing buying sabzis in the office? but we could do it because we were small.
No, but it's, I mean, I think that's great. It's absolutely, it's a practical solution to something which everybody has to deal with on a daily basis. So, Sunny, you were my missing panelist for some time.
I do apologize. I got very discombobulated
I mean, it was
outside.
truly an example
really
of
do
diverse
apologize.
behavior, but welcome. So, so now that we've sort of been around and you're the only one who's left, so you did say that you will speak about your prize. We also heard you earlier.
Do I need to speak about my prize again, or should we talk wider issues that I had raised?
It would be nice if you talked wider issues, but maybe some people were not there in the morning, so just at least tell us a little bit about your prize and why.
Okay.
Why?
So, first of all, I must say I'm slightly embarrassed to be on this panel. Partly because I think this is the closest I'll come to being a white woman. And the reason I say that is because I am Hindu, I'm upper caste, I have a tertiary education, and by default I'm part of the middle class. I really shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be talking about diversity at all. I'm smack center of this social construct that exists in this country. So having laid that out, I think it's fair to then say I can speak from my current situation, which is in Britain, where, interestingly enough, I'm on the margins, because I'm a woman of color, I'm a migrant, I face all the structural issues that, we've discussed nicely. Niko, I came in midway through, so you've covered lots of ground on that. So 5 years ago, a report came out looking at publishing and the lack of representation in publishing. Perhaps that's a better term than diversity. I hate that term. I'm tired of it. So the fact that people of color weren't represented in books, but also writers weren't represented in, most writers of color in Britain are unagented. Most writers of color are sort of led, whether explicitly or implicitly, to write about their culture. So if you wanted to write, let's say, a big book on Boris Johnson, or the move further right of the Tory party, that would somehow not be your area. So these are structural, quite sort of embedded issues. And of course, the kinds of budgets writers of color get, the kind of publishing contracts. So all of these had come up quite strongly. And so Nikesh, who's another writer, and I decided that we wanted to start a prize. It's called the Chalak Prize for Book of the Year by a writer of color. We were very fortunate. We found a fellow migrant, person of color, who works in the city, who very nicely put up some money. He said, "What do you need?" And I said, "Well, it would be nice to have some cash to put it up." So we were able to therefore cut through all the mess of Arts Council and government funding, and so we became really kind of an independent body, because we knew we could do what we wanted. And so now the prize is in its 4th year. We hit University Challenge on the first Monday of the year, which is a very long-standing TV program in Britain, and that I think makes us an institution in the UK. But I think the reasons behind it were not so much about diversity and inclusion, because the way I look at it, if you're going to have a table of food and you don't invite everybody who is in your home to eat, that table is exclusive. But here's the other side. If you invite somebody and you make sure that what's on the table cannot be eaten by them, because you've not bothered to make the rest of the decisions, then it doesn't matter if you invited them. They're going to starve anyway. And I think the issues around diversity and inclusion come down to that. Often companies, publishing houses, but also larger institutions will tick a box. Say, look, we need a person of color, we need somebody from a different religion, here, different caste. Can we, similar dynamics, the forms they take are different. We'll tick a box, we'll invite somebody, we'll hire them, we'll get them on our board. But unless you're actually going to make sure you've made the structural changes, it means nothing. Now, what Urvashi, your point was brilliant. That small thing of being able to buy vegetables in the office, that's more than feminist practice. That is creating that structural change within the environment, within the institution, to say, yes, we not only are going to hire women and pay them equally, just so you, reminder, please pay women equally, but also make things easier for them to actually be there. And I think that's really, for me, that's the kind of structural change that is required. I'll give you a simple example. Publishing in most of British publishing is based in London. Not all of it, but quite a large chunk of it. Publishing is terribly paid. London is a very, very expensive city. By default, this means you would have to be that person out of Oxford or Cambridge with mummy and daddy supporting you to be able to work for £17,000 a year. Now, that is not inclusion. It doesn't matter. You haven't bothered to make the structural changes. I'm part of I've been sort of signal boosting and making a noise about it. There's a campaign to ask for pay transparency. Publishing industry is terrible. They'll announce jobs and not put up, say how much you're going to get paid. And that is crucial because we need that kind of information. We need those structural changes to happen. So at least when people apply, they know they can actually make a living and they can live in the city they're supposed to work in. So I don't think that's a minor point at all. I think what you said was absolutely spot on.
Yeah, so I mean, you're basically talking about the proclivity towards tokenism when it comes to being inclusive and diverse. So, but once you started the prize, what was the reaction from your potential winners or people who were actually going to be impacted by it in some way?
So this is a very interesting point. When you start something disruptive, when you disrupt, and I think Urvashi, you know, in many ways, you're a trailblazer, and so I was kind of look at heroines and go, right, who are the heroines? How did they deal with it? So you get a lot of flack coming your way. So when the Jalak Prize was launched, we had an incredible response from other writers of color. It's really turned into a community, to the point that after the first year, we were madly trying to set it up and chase our tails, trying to get things done. Just after the second, the prize was announced, a Ghanaian British writer, Dorothy Kimson, got in touch with me, and she said, I know a check is nice, but for a writer, something physical, a trophy, would be lovely. And she said, I've just got a bit of money, because she'd signed a contract. And she said, I'll pay for a trophy. And so the first year, I said, look, Dorothy, I don't have time for this. Can you do it? She said, I'll look up the artist, because artists of color have the same problem. And I will find the artist, they'll run it by you, you create a brief, and they'll create a trophy. So the first trophy was created by a wonderful, wonderful artist from Glasgow School of Art, Jamaican British, Chris Bramble, and Dorothy paid for it. And from that came an idea that we now, she obviously, none of us have the money, so we raised, a hat goes around, who can pitch in. But now we have every year a Jalak art residency. So an artist of color is commissioned to create a unique sculpture or a piece of art that serves as a trophy. Now, that's the good side of this. That's the nice part of the story. Our community has grown as writers and artists around the prize, and we do lots of stuff. So we go into refugee centers and we work with children, because frankly, if people are coming to Europe, to Britain, to make a life, what better book to read than books written by people like them about making a life in Britain? So that's the idea. So we it's grown. Now the bad side of it, we got a lot of flack in the press, including an anonymously written article in the LRB about how it was going to dilute literary merit, of course. But the first year, just before we were about to award the prize, so we were in a reception, full room, we had an 8-page legalese letter from the Equalities Commission because an MP, who can be named, honorary member Philip Davies, decided to complain that it was a racist prize because it excluded white people. So we then it was quite a frustrating time. It was also very hectic. Of course, we didn't know what it meant for our liabilities. You know, 2 writers starting something, yeah, always a bad idea. But we got very lucky. Thanks to Twitter, for those of you who aren't on Twitter, we found a wonderful lawyer who I didn't know until she started representing us pro bono, is possibly one of the top human rights lawyers in the country, which was really brilliant. And she represented us. And finally, it was about 6 months until Equalities Commission agreed that there was no case against us. But more than that, we insisted that they issue a public statement that Jalak Prize was the kind of initiative they would support and they were supposed to support, which they did. But it was 6 months of very long sleepless nights and a lot of stress. So I can tell you both sides of the story. It's not all good.
So the perils of diversity,
Well, I think
the pushback.
Well, the thing is, I mean, my view is that if you're going to demand change and if you're going to act change, it threatens a lot of people because you're destabilizing things. People like comfort. People, I mean, I love the fact that those kids are on the street. I love the fact that these women are sitting in Shaheen Bagh because that's threatening. That is terrifying to people in power. And I think we should expect the pushback. I just didn't think that it would
Take such an extreme
weaponize
form, yeah.
that a state that professes to be a democracy and work by rule of law would weaponize an arm of the state to come after private citizens. It was a salutary lesson, but I think it's useful to know that no, we can't take rule of law for granted, regardless of what is there. So that's not a bad thing to learn.
So, Atiya, we've come full circle, and I think we'll come back to school education, and we'll talk about what is it that can be done at the level of ideas, which are perhaps threatening but somewhat subversive in how they operate, so that the whole idea of diversity is so insidious that it creeps into all the content without people being immediately threatened by it, but it sort of becomes part of the very fabric of how we think and how accepting we can be of it.
It has kind of become a culture at Ratnasagar because most of the editors are there now. They are around. Nobody who joins RS goes away. So most of the editors are now they are around for 10 to 15 years. So if they have become part of their thinking, and it's not just about gender, like differently able. So if you just put a story for a grade 2, that is my friend Sarah, and she moves around in a chair which has wheels. That's enough to put that idea in child's mind, and they are playing together. The kids are playing together. So now that idea is there, and it's not disruptive yet. It's become a part of the story. The child knows, okay, Sarah cannot walk. She moves it around in a chair with wheels, and then they are playing in the park. So for kids, for little kids, that's enough. I just remembered in a new book for class 8, we put in a story that Jayanti and Razia are friends. They live together. They have a little daughter who's called Julie or something like that. That's enough. And then you have the story.
It's a new Amar
That
Akbar
puts in the
anthem.
idea, yeah. That puts in the idea in their heads.
Okay, but
And single parenthood is also there.
sure.
These things, they come in. A mother, I live with my mother. There's something about the family. So I live with my mother. We live in a house which has just one room. We have a bed, this, that. We are a family. So you can't use too much of text for little kids. So you have to show pictures and just put in the seed of the idea and it grows.
So actually, with pictures, it's easier.
Pictures
In
say a
some ways
lot,
to
yes.
have diversity.
Pictures say a
because
lot.
language is tricky.
There are kids wearing glasses. There are kids with braces. There are plum kids. There are dark kids. There are Sikh kids. So there's a girl with a hijab now, recently put in that. So that speaks so much, and the teachers have to be trained. We do about 1800 to 1900 complementary workshops for teachers, training them, sensitizing them. Ms. Sridhar Balan sitting here also does some of the workshops for different schools. So that way, I mean, we have, to an extent, we brought in some change. And 20 years back, we had only girls in the editorial department. Now it's about 70-30.
You have some boys as well.
There are some boys are there. And they are the ones who will come up with, no, we can't take this story. Anne of the Green Gables is not done. It shows some bias. This story is not done. No, we can't take this writer because he has this against him. So it's very nice to see these boys getting really sensitized, not just to gender, all kinds of biases. Class is something I'm very bothered about. Religion, region.
Yeah, so I was going to actually touch upon religion, even
Yes.
though it's a slightly tricky thing
Yeah.
to touch upon at this
And
present
we have to move
moment in
within
history.
a syllabus. So in their sagacity, the government board has the syllabus which says places in the neighborhood for 6-year-olds. And places in the neighborhood would include a hospital, a school, fine, a fire station, police station, fine, and places of worship. So how do you present places of worship without? So the book which was in the market when I made my book said, Muslims pray in a mosque, Hindus pray in a temple, Christians pray in a church. So thinking about it, then we made up a story that Aslam and Surjit and Julie and Asma, somebody, they are friends. They play together, they study in the same class, they live in the same colony. Aslam goes to a mosque, Susan goes to a church, it's that way, and they pray to the same God. That was the only way you could bring in some diversity into that diktat of the syllabus that we have to put in places of worship there.
Okay, so then coming from primary school education to your place of work, when we are working at such a basic level, still when we are making the citizens of tomorrow and we are grappling with.
And if I could interrupt, about a moderately successful book sells about 50 to 60,000. 50 to 60,000 kids are reading these things every year, and the shelf life of a book is about 20 years. So somewhere there's.
Yeah, I mean, we all live in hope. With every book is an act of hope in that sense, isn't it?
Or despair.
No, I'd like to believe it's a place of hope, really. But coming back to feminist practice and content in the workplace, so there was Sharir Ki Jankari, the book that you referred to. But if it came to a book which was borderline difficult for you to do purely because it didn't sit well with your political beliefs and it was written by a woman, and you could actually talk to her about the content, how strong would your editorializing be in terms of maintaining the diversity of opinion and yet ensuring that it's not reactionary?
Well, I hope quite strong because I think, in answer to the question you were asking, Atiya, I think one of the most difficult things to deal with is how deeply naturalized, even in those of us who see ourselves as within quotes progressive or feminist, the biases and the homogeneity of the society we inhabit, our class inhabits.
The stereotypes.
Yeah, it's there deeply in us. So many of my feminist writers who call themselves feminists will produce, let's say, a children's book and will naturally veer towards having the central character as a young boy because it's the predictable thing to do.
A North Indian young boy. Mostly.
Yes, that too. A North Indian Hindu young boy.
Some Sharma or some Khanna.
Absolutely. And when you talk to them about it, it's very difficult for them to see that they are, just even that choice is a choice which is dictated by certain things that exist in their heads which they need to get out of. So, and it's a very difficult discussion because then they will say, but I'm a feminist and you're a feminist and surely you should understand and I'm a creative writer and so on and so forth. And of course, it's a difficult ground to tread because you cannot, as an editor, impose your thinking on the creator that your writer is, that your author is. But somewhere we have to have that dialogue. And sometimes you win and sometimes you don't.
It's as simple as just flipping it around. I am Anil, this is my sister Tara. I am Tara, this is my brother Anil.
But sometimes it's not that simple.
No,
Atiya.
for
got
the
much
little
more to
ones
it.
it gets that.
I think Niko wants to come in. Niko wants to come in.
I was just thinking about some connected threads about what people have been saying, and I think that I was struck by this example of 75 authors, right? Because I think one of the challenges that we all face is pragmatism, right? I think that analogously speaking, we talk a lot about privacy right now in terms of technology, but our behavior suggests that we will always prioritize convenience over privacy, right? It's time and again. We talk about privacy with and similarly, I think there's politics and there's pragmatism. And I think language is inherently reductionist, right? Language is a shortcut. Terms are inherently shortcuts. And I think that one of the ways in which any kind of progressive initiative or practice is undermined is if it is somehow anti-pragmatic, right? So I have two daughters who are now young adults, and we were having a conversation about the acronym thread or the alphabet thread of gender identity, right? LGBTQIA plus, and I think that's the sort of thing that is massively alienating to people who have not been steeped in that, in that sequence. And both of my daughters said, "Yeah, well, nobody says that anymore. We just say queer." And I was like, "Okay, well, that's easy, right? That's a sort of catch-all phrase, and it's pragmatic." And I think that I remember I'm a former editor and was publishing a book, and the author wanted to use the term to refer to college students, to older college students, non-traditionally aged students. And I said, how about we just say older students? And she said, well, it's a little pejorative. It's seen as pejorative. And I was like, it's not pejorative. Oh, it's descriptive. Old, some people are older than other people. And she was adamant about it, and I just said, I'm not publishing a book that has the phrase non-traditionally aged student appear, 137 times in a 28-page chapter. Like that violates my publishing ethos. And so we settled on adult students, which was short and met both our needs. But I think that, that notion of pragmatism, we can't overlook it because, people want quick, simple, short solutions, and I think that's something that we have to be able to integrate it because the idea of putting 75 names on a book cover, you might as well just drive a stake into the heart of that book in terms of actually successfully projecting it to its market because it'll look like an eye chart, So, well, no, exactly. So that's the perfect solution, right? But if you put it on the front, that's the end of the book. So,
I think, can I just step in? I think there's a couple of things to think about. I know you've not quite used that term, but there is a kind of phrase that's been doing the rounds. It started from various Reddit spots, and it does have its provenance in the far right. And this diversity of ideas, that somehow all ideas are equal, that somehow we should be debating everything. And there's a kind of both-sidism of going, oh, well, but, yes, but students, but they did this and they did that. And I think I go back to James Baldwin. When people's humanity and right to exist is threatened, there is no ground for debate. And I think we need to keep that in mind. I also think that any initiative that goes, as I said, for me, I talk about equality, justice, and decolonization. I hate the terms inclusion and diversity because they mean nothing. If we're going to look at justice, if we're going to look at equality, if we're going to look at decolonization, this requires us to be led by the people who are bearing the brunt of the oppression. So if somebody who is trans wants to be considered trans, it is not my place as a cis woman to say, no, I'm not going to use that term because it's inconvenient to me. Pragmatism works to a certain point, but pragmatism is really, it's convenience for people who have the luxury of convenience. And I think that's where we really need to be very, very careful. I think everyone on the stage and everyone in this room is in extraordinarily privileged places where we aren't necessarily on the front line of that.
Sure. So I think we have to keep interrogating ourselves when it comes to understanding diversity and all its implications in our lives. And I can see Neeta desperately signaling, so we really have to stop. Thank you very much.